Be seated. This week for our gospel lesson, I will invite you to remain seated. The gospel lesson is coming from John 9, verses 1 through 41. I've very much enjoyed over the past couple weeks having this narrative, so we continue in this way today. Now today we're going to hear a story of when Jesus heals a blind man, or so as we all know that is often the title or reference point for this story. A story of a blind man appears in all four of the Gospels with some overlapping similarities in some aspects of the story. But here in the Gospel of John, Jesus heals a man who has been blind from birth, which is the only time that a healing happens in this way. So, in these opening lines, listen to this first exchange with Jesus, the disciples, and the blind man.
As he walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?"
Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud over the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. Then he went and washed and came back able to see.
You see, the commonly held Jewish belief was that if a person had an ailment or even had bad luck to come their way, then it must be the result of either the person's sin or the sin of a family member that was being passed down to the next generation. And since this man was blind from birth, the disciples asked the clarifying question to inquire if it was the parent's sin or his own sin that caused him to be born blind. But Jesus answers that it's neither. Jesus proclaims that God's mighty works will be displayed through him. He then miraculously heals the man's blindness. But after the healing, we then experience the longest absence of Jesus in all of John's gospel. Listen to the next conversation, or should I say interrogation, that unfolds.
The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some were saying, "It is he." Others were saying, "No, but it is someone like him." And he kept saying, "I am the man." But they kept asking him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' Then I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know."
They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight.
He said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, then I washed, and now I see."
Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And they were divided. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened."
He said, "He is a prophet."
The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, "Is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?"
The parents answered, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but we do not know how it is that now he sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him."
So for the second time they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, Give glory to God. We know this man is a sinner."
He answered, "I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see."
They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?"
He answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?"
Then they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from."
The man answered, "Here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing."
They answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and are you trying to teach us?" And they drove him out.
"I have told you already, but you would not listen." After gaining sight, this once blind man's parents were called in to verify that this was, in fact, their son, for it seems that he was unrecognizable to the community in which he was raised. They wanted answers from him about how he could now see. But when they told him what happened, the community didn't believe him. His parents dismissed any responsibility or association they might have, saying, "He can speak for himself. We don't want to be kicked out of the synagogue because of him." And some of the Pharisees, who remember are the religious leaders of the law, suggested Jesus must be a sinner for having done a healing on the Sabbath. But other Pharisees said, "Yeah, but anyone who can perform such a miracle as this, how? How can he be a sinner?" The whole scene is full of dissension, confusion, and doubt, accusations, and eventually this once blind man is exiled from the synagogue. The community and its leaders, who were just trying to follow the rules, thought, "How did this happen? And who can be blamed?" But the story isn't finished, for Jesus enters the scene again.
Jesus heard that they had driven the blind man out. And when Jesus found the blind man, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?"
He answered, "And who is he, sir? Tell me, so that I may believe in him."
Jesus said to him, "You have seen him. The one who is speaking to you is he."
He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him.
Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind."
Some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him, "Surely we are not blind, are we?"
And Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say, 'We see,' your sin remains." This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. Thank you to our readers of the gospel and to Edie Reed again. This has been really fun to read scripture in this way over the past couple of weeks. Let us pray together this morning. Loving God, reveal your hopes and desires to each one of us gathered here today. Open our eyes so that we may see. Amen. In the Word on Wednesday this week, I talked about how my brother and I checked out 3D picture books from the library when we were kids. These books, which were a huge craze in the 90s, contain stereograms. These pictures involve complex shapes and images on a one-dimensional page, but when you focus and stare at the picture long enough, the scene begins to come to life. A new image is before you, containing depth and dimension. Last week, John talked about how Samaritans would often spit on the ground if they saw Gentiles coming their way. It was a sign of disgust and disrespect of the other group. In today's story, we see Jesus spit on the ground, but then making some mud to spread on a man who has been blind from birth. Jesus often uses something that to others might be seen as one thing, transforming it to become something of a healing, a tool of reconciliation. This week, I invite us all, through a lens of faith, to look at this story. There are many nuances to this narrative that have transforming power because of the presence of Jesus. So we have to be willing to look deeply, understanding that through our lens of faith, we might just begin to see a new image emerge, God's work of a new vision taking shape if we but focus our attention. Now, at face value, what are some aspects of this story? We know that Jesus performed a miracle by healing this man born blind from birth. We know that the community saw him of little to no value because of his blindness that they associated with sin. We know that the community didn't even recognize him once Jesus healed him. We know that his parents did not defend him because they didn't want to be kicked out of the synagogue themselves. And we know that the Pharisees became divided, trying to decide if Jesus could be from God for doing this miracle on the Sabbath. You see, the Pharisees were a group who believed they had it all together. They were all about good and righteous living, even at the expense of others. They certainly were rule followers. They excluded people from participating in order to keep things the way that they saw fit. Following rules allowed them to feel like they were in control. Now, I have a confession. As much as I like creativity and expression, I'm pretty much a rule follower. I make lists and check things off to feel accomplished. I like to live up to expectations. I'll even admit that sometimes I will write down something I've already done just to be able to put a check mark next to it. Does anybody else do this? Looking back, when I was growing up, I now realize that in many ways I developed a list of things that were right and wrong about being a Christian. Now, this wasn't a physical list of characteristics or attributes written on a sheet of paper, but even as a young child, I developed a checklist that included expectations of how I and others should act and behave. It became comfortable to have these expectations and to write people off because they didn't fit the mold or follow my standards. Now, rules and standards in and of themselves are not a bad thing. I'm not saying that at all. They can help create order. They can help keep us safe. For example, what is a red octagon with the letters S-T-O-P? What does that indicate to us? Stop, or hopefully it does. But there are even signs and signals that guide the order of our church. The sheet of paper you received when you walked into the sanctuary, for example, tells us what to do while we are here in worship together. Our bulletins guide our entire experience, well, as long as John and I follow it, which I have failed to do on several occasions. But even if I skip over something, the bulletin tells me how to get back on track. There are many churches that don't use a bulletin, but for us, the presence of the bulletin is a piece of our tradition. The presence of the blind man in today's story was a signal to the Pharisees of sin. Who they believed him to be was not who they wanted to be or even associate with, so in turn, their rules and traditions gave them permission to dismiss and exclude him from community. When I was in Washington, D.C. during seminary, I lived in an intentional community attached to a downtown United Methodist church that in recent years had been undergoing some revitalization. The small yet growing number of members had identified that they wanted to focus on connecting with the community, seeking to invite their neighbors inside the doors of the church. That was going to be their priority. What they started to experience, though, was a number of people beginning to occupy the two big porches surrounding the sanctuary as a shelter. The porches started to fill with sleeping bags tucked away during the day, trash left on the porches, and occasionally there were even places that were used as a restroom facility. The church was trying to welcome the surrounding community to utilize their space for events and meetings, wanting to become more of a presence in the neighborhood. So the visitors on the porch seemed to agitate their plan to appear neat and tidy. After about a year of battling the constant cleaning of the porches, often having to kick sleeping individuals off the porch so that an event could take place, and having to hose down the space in order to get rid of the smells, the church decided to begin a dialogue about possible solutions. After contemplating and brainstorming many ideas, someone suggested that they go and talk to the people that they were talking about. So they did. And what they discovered was that many of the folks were doing their best to find jobs or to go on interviews, and they had no place to put their stuff during the day or to get ready for their interviews. So after some thoughts and conversations, the church decided to start a shower ministry where folks could come in and get ready for the day. And they found some closet space where some belongings could be stored. The once bothersome porch dwellers became their friends, people with stories and struggles. They mutually decided to make some decisions about best practices and created some rules to guide this new relationship. Because remember, rules are not what is harmful or sinful, but it's rather the resistance to allowing those rules to be adjusted to welcome an opportunity to see in a new way. Initially, blinded by their own ideas of who they would attract and welcome into their space, the church became bigger as they truly began to welcome their neighbors as they had originally set out to do with their mission. No, it didn't look the way that they expected, and some changes had to be made along the way. But the conversations that unfolded with members discussing how to address the issue led to recognizing the joy of seeing God's presence and work in the community. They realized that it was through this experience that they had an opportunity to welcome the presence of God in their midst as they became co-creators with God, casting a new vision, reaching out to a group who already felt comfortable calling the church home. Nadia Boltz-Weber is a Lutheran pastor in Denver, Colorado. She uses a really provoking metaphor of what inclusion looks like. She suggests we often create this tent under which we claim to feel comfortable including anybody, but it's constructed of our own rules, behaviors, and traditions. Our inclusion, our all are welcome, requires them to come and fit under our tent, to come to us. She proposes that instead we need to extend the poles of our tent to include those we're trying to keep outside. Division often occurs because of personal or corporate rules, behaviors, and traditions. We see and experience these in our world, in our nation, in our own United Methodist denomination, and even within our own families. We become like the Pharisees when they question how Jesus could be from God if he was performing a miracle on the Sabbath. Some of them thought, how could he be? And others thought, how could he not be? These people were of the same group who saw things differently. And Jesus seems to say to them, if you fail to see my presence among you, your eyes remain blind. But if you're willing to consider looking beyond your established rules and traditions, you will receive sight. Upon hearing these words, the Pharisees thought, surely we aren't the ones who are blind, are we? It can't be us. We're following the laws, and we don't have anything wrong with us, do we? They weren't recognizing the Messiah, even though Jesus is standing right in front of them. There are times when we do miss the opportunity to welcome Jesus standing right in front of us. The great writer and teacher Barbara Brown Taylor says of this passage, "The Pharisees of today may well be found among us and in us whenever we reflexively defend tradition or become too certain of our own righteousness." You see, the picture is painted for us. When something occurs that doesn't fit our mold, or even our idea of good and right living, whether it be within a community or family, or even the broader society, it's easy, or at least tempting, for us to be like the Pharisees, failing to look beyond what we see as possible and recognizing God's presence and the potential to become co-creators with God, casting a new vision. We often want to be able to point a finger or to be mad at somebody. We often try to distance ourselves and say, "That's not my problem," just like the man's parents. When someone doesn't ascribe to our set of rules, behaviors, and traditions, we are tempted to judge, to blame, to exclude. Can we blame genetics or society? Or label the person in a way that will create a distance between me and who they are? We strive to create a belief that I am different. Surely, Jesus, you aren't talking to me. But Jesus is talking to us, inviting us to look at our own lives, to consider where we might be turning a blind eye in order to maintain a world that we want to see. We often can be the very ones who are blind to the movement of God in the world around us, to Jesus standing right in front of us, asking us to see with a heart that is open. The grace offered to each of us is God reaching out and extending the tent poles to include even us. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I am found. Was blind, but now I see. I stand in need to receive God's grace, not the other person, but me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. And it's that invitation Jesus gives in this story. Standing with the once blind man, he spoke to the Pharisees saying, "Open your eyes. Open your heart so that you might see Jesus standing right in front of you. You excluded this man because of how you perceived his blindness, but you, in fact, are the ones who are blind." My prayer this morning is that we might be willing to open our eyes from the blindness we all have. The opening of the eyes is an invitation to open our hearts. It's an invitation to look into our lives and allow Jesus to take some mud, dirty and messy as it is, and spread it on the parts of our lives where we are blind, to those in our communities, maybe even our own families, and certainly places in the world where we are failing to see God's presence and the opportunity to become co-creators with God, casting a new vision. And the good news, my friends, is that we don't walk alone. God goes with us. Amen. The closing hymn today